Hello everybody, Josh here again. In this video I'll be discussing basic for loops. While for loops are a pretty simple subject, using them correctly can be crucial even in a high-level programming environment. Also, like with most programming concepts, it's important to understand the basics before trying to move on to the more complicated ideas. But without further ado, sit back and enjoy. So what is a for loop? A for loop is a loop that performs a specific amount of iterations, also known as a count-controlled loop. There are three elements that a count-controlled loop must possess. It must initialize a control variable to a starting value. It must also test the control variable by comparing it to the maximum value. When the control variable reaches this maximum value, the loop terminates. Finally, it must update the control variable during each iteration. This is usually done by incrementing the variable. On the slide now is the format of a typical for loop. The initialization is where your counter will be starting. The test is what you'll be comparing your counter to before each iteration. The update is the change will be made to the counter after the loop is executed. Here's an example of what a for loop looks like in Java. I'll be going over some examples later, so I won't talk about this now. You should note, however, that if your for loop contains more than one statement, you must enclose its contents in curly braces in order for it to work properly. While this isn't required in the example code above, it is always good practice to enclose all for loops with braces. In our first example, I've created a very basic for loop. You can see that I've initialized our counter to 1, set our max value to 10, and made our update condition I plus 1. The statement, which you'll notice I did enclose in braces, will print off hello and tell us how many times the loop ran. Now, if everything works as it should, the loop should execute 10 times and then exit. So let's go ahead and run it. And as you can see, it did exactly what it was supposed to. In this slide, I've drawn up a simple logic diagram to show how a for loop works. In this example, I start off by assigning 0 to I. The loop will then check to see if I is less than 10. If this is true, then the statement, or statements, will execute and I will be incremented by 1. We are then thrown back up to right before the test condition. Once again, I will be compared to 10. This process continues until the condition is no longer met, at which point the loop will exit. Because the for loop tests its Boolean expression before it performs an iteration, it's known as a pretest loop. Because of this, it is possible to write a for loop in such a way that it will never iterate, although there isn't really a practical reason for doing this. This slide contains a few extra points of information that you may find useful when attempting to use a for loop. The first is that you should avoid modifying the control variable in the body of the loop. While this won't necessarily throw an error, you may find that you get different results than you expected. Secondly, there are also a number of different ways to implement a loop. Below I've laid out two examples. The first increments I by 2 each iteration, and the second is a loop that counts down instead of up. Sometimes, you may want the user to determine the maximum value of the control variable in a for loop, and therefore determine the number of times the loop iterates. The code below takes in an integer from the user and uses that in its Boolean expression. In our final coding example, I'll be demonstrating a user-controlled loop. I start off by declaring a new scanner called keyboard. I then ask the user how many times they would like the loop to iterate, using the variable counter to store the number in. Finally, I declare a for loop using the variable as the max value. Now, I'll go ahead and run the program. And let's say I enter 3 here. The loop runs 3 times, just as it should. Well, once again, that wraps up our video. As always, feel free to post any questions you might have in the comments below, and if you'd like to be notified when a new video is posted, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for watching.